All right, so I just messed up. All right, welcome back to another episode featuring myself, the U.S. History Diva. All right, so if you're watching this video, I'm assuming by now you have completed another anticipation guide. You saw that almost fell. Another anticipation guide which covers causes of World War I, in addition to the reasons explaining why the United States decided to enter the war. But just to refresh your memory, I want to quickly recap the reasons why the United States decided to enter the war. One reason to help us understand why the United States decided to engage in a war that really was between Germany and Britain was due to money. During this time, or what I would say is prior to the United States engaging in a war, the war had already took place for about 2 to 3 years. It was already happening at the time when we were considering entering the war. So we were considering entering the war because of money. Now, what does money have to do with the situation? Well, due to the fact that we were playing what we would call we were taking a neutral stance in this war, we actually loaned money to Great Britain as well as to Germany. The difference was that we loaned more money to Britain. If you look at the PowerPoint, it states the United States Bank loaned money, oh shit. I did it again. Loaned over $2 billion to the Allies, which AKA Great Britain. So we were like, wait a minute. If the Allies lose the war, then we could potentially miss out on getting $2 billion back. And we actually needed that money in order to keep our economy going. So we were taking a neutral position, but at the same time, we were contemplating entering the war to assist the Allies due to the fact that we had a lot of money at stake. Second reason why we considered and eventually entered World War I was due to this situation taking place between Great Britain and Germany. The British decided to impose what we would call a blockade. A blockade does not allow important materials, supplies, and resources to enter your country. And this was having a major impact on Germany to the point where millions of Germans living in Germany were dying of starvation and hunger. In addition to the blockade having an impact on Germany, it was also having an impact on us getting supplies out to countries that we were conducting business with. So with Germany becoming so upset about the British blockade, they began a series of sinking any ships that they saw in the sea. And they used that as their form of retaliation against the British blockade. But them sinking all ships resulted in them sinking one specific ship called the British liner Lusitania. Okay, the British liner Lusitania, for those of you that can't see, was sunk by the Germans. And as a result of that, 128 Americans died. And you already know how we get. When Americans die, we automatically feel like, wait a minute, we got to jump in. So we were already feeling a little salty about that. In addition to so much propaganda and public opinion in support of the British, and at the same time against Germany. I got it. Another cause for the United States to engage in World War I would be the infamous Zimmerman Note. This is always on the EOC. It will definitely be on your next test. But the Zimmerman note was a telegram where we read details of a proposed alliance between Germany and Mexico. So the Germans hollered at the Mexicans and was like, look, we already know y'all don't like the U.S. You're right next door to the United States. So we should link up and join forces to defeat the United States in retaliation for them taking away states like Texas, parts of Arizona, Nevada, you name it. We took it from Mexico many years ago, but the Germans tried to, basically instigate a war between Mexico and the United States. And once we caught wind of that, we was like, oh, perhaps this neutral position that we're taking, we may need to think twice about it, because if they're willing to go this far to keep us out of World War I, then perhaps we should engage in World War I. I mean, money's on the line, Americans have died, and now you're trying to start some with Mexico. So pretty much after the Zimmerman note, it was a wrap. The United States decided to go to war against Germany and the Central Powers. At this point, I would say after year 3 of the war, us engaging in a war was pretty much necessary because of another event that took place in Europe called the Russian Revolution. As a result of the Russians having their own issues and experiencing their own revolution, Russia decided to withdraw from the war, which was a bonus for Germany because the Germans have one less individual or country to fight against, which means now they could dedicate their entire focus on Great Britain and the smaller allies. That wasn't good. Why? Because that puts Germany in a better position to win the war. And if Germany wins the war, then we could potentially not get our money back. All right, I'm back. I had to pause. The student interrupted me. Okay. So, like I said, Russian Revolution put Germany in a better position to win the war. We couldn't have that because if Germany wins, then we could potentially not get all that money back. So we was like, we're jumping in. Okay. Now that we've decided to enter the war, first thing that was necessary for us to do was mobilize and build an army. So with the help of President Woodrow Wilson, we were able to build an army by starting a draft. Okay, you will see on your test conscription, aka the draft. What is the draft? The draft is when we pretty much require all men, all adult men, to register on a list that the United States government will ultimately use to determine who will go to war in defense of the United States of America. On your test, that draft was initiated through a legislation, a law called the Selective Service Act. Once again, this law required all men to register for the draft. How many men were drafted into this war? Almost 3 million men. Now, did we have any men volunteer to engage in the war? Yes, we did. We had about 2 million men. So we had a combination of individuals going to war. Some volunteered, others did not. We actually had some men that refused to engage in the war because, according to those men, it went against their religious beliefs. They did not believe in killing someone else. If you recall, the Bible does say, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not cheat. But that's a whole nother subject. All right, so the men who refused, because it violated their religious beliefs, we actually classified those young men as conscientious, get it? I'm using my conscious, objectors. I'm objecting to engaging in combat because my conscience won't allow me to do it. It goes against my religious beliefs. Now, if their names were pulled off of the draft list, did they have to report to work? Yes, but the United States government did consider their religious beliefs and they assigned them to non-combat duties. So yeah, they were still sent to Europe. They may not have had to have carried a gun or killed someone, but they were put to work. All right? Now, if you were not able to prove that you were a conscientious objector and you're just refusing because like you ain't trying to do that, you were put in prison. You were put in jail for violating the Selective Service Act. So first things first, get the people going, get them shipped out to Europe. Second thing that was on our agenda, okay, of not only engaging in the war, but most importantly, winning the war, was to rally public support for this war. We needed everyone in America to be on the same page. We needed everyone in America to understand that this war was about not just winning, but saving democracy. All right? We went as far as convincing Americans that this war was the right thing to do. Yes, we have to go out there and we have to support our alliances, our friends, our besties, all in the name of saving democracy. How effective were we at influencing public support for this war? We were very effective. And this is how we were able to do it. We were able to do it through a technique called propaganda. What is propaganda? It's when you basically provide very skewed, biased, and misleading information. And the purpose of providing this very narrow and skewed information is to get people to formulate an opinion about something. How do you get people to do that? Pictures, captions, almost like Instagram, The Shade Room, Baller Alert, all of those accounts that we follow, they use propaganda. They provide very biased, misleading information, and as a result of them providing that, they're formulating our opinion in reference to a person, in regards to a topic and or issue. So this technique of influencing people is nothing new. The United States government is notorious for doing this, and it went as far as creating a department called the Committee of Public Information. So this department was led by a gentleman that goes by the name of George Creel, and that's all they did. They published stories, posters, and the main objective, the purpose, was to sell the war, was to get everyone to understand that the war was necessary, not the war was necessary, scratch that it was necessary for the United States to enter the war, to join forces with the Allies in order to save the world and democracy. Very effective. People were in full support of the war. And you'll see what happens to those that refuse to be misled by these propaganda posters and articles. Let's continue. So far, we're mobilizing the people through the Selective Service Act. We're forming public opinions through the through the Committee of Public Information, which was led by George Creel. Now, let's take a look at some other things that our president at the time, Woodrow Wilson, did in order to have us engage in a war, but most importantly, win the war. One of the first things that he did was establish a number of departments that you should see on your handout right now. One of the most important departments that he worked on and established was the War Labor Board. Now, if you can recall anything that I've taught you since August, we spent a lot of time discussing the labor movement. And during this time in history, the workers were initiating strikes in hopes that they could get the government's attention to establish a better relationship between them and the business owners. The government did not respond in the way that the strikers hoped for, so there wasn't much progress in that movement. Now, why am I making this comment? Because this is our first glimpse at the government actually doing something for the workers. But the truth is, they were really doing it for the war, but the workers were able to reap some of the benefits of this department that was established. This department is called the War Labor Board, and the War Labor Board was responsible for handling disputes between owners and workers. In other words, let's settle this conflict. Let's resolve this beef in order to avoid strikes. And the only reason why they wanted to avoid those strikes was because they could not afford to have strikes take place during the war. They needed these businesses to manufacture and make things that were necessary for the war. So yes, the intent wasn't to help the workers. It was to help us win the war, but the workers did benefit from it. Moving on. Here's another department that was created under Woodrow Wilson called the War Industries Board. This department was responsible for persuading businesses to create items, products, and supplies that were needed for the war. In other words, if you had a shoe company, we don't need you creating the latest Pumas. Mine's really cute. Creating the latest Pumas for citizens. We need you to create boots. We need you to create shoes for the soldiers that are engaging in war. All that other stuff could wait. Okay? Now, did the companies listen to the government under the War Industries Board? They definitely did, because there was an incentive for them. The government was willing to pay extra for these supplies. So it did a number of things. What did it do? It prevented a shortage of supplies for the military, and it increased profits for business owners. So in this case, everyone's winning. I'm making supplies and items for the military. In some way, I feel as if I am being patriotic, and I'm making a load of cash. Moving on, next department, Food Administration. This department oversaw the production of food. In other words, they regulated food prices by increasing them. Why would the government encourage farmers and other food producers to increase their prices? Because it's simple, it's easy. As prices go up, demand goes down. If the cost of broccoli has doubled in its price, then I as a consumer have no desire to buy it. Okay? So by increasing food prices, it resulted in people buying less food, which is what they wanted. They wanted people to limit their food intake because they needed the food for the soldiers. All right, so take a look at this. Food Administration oversaw the production of food. They increased food prices and asked civilians in the country to reduce consumption. In other words, go on a diet. Okay? Don't drink that tea. Okay, that was lame, but anyways, okay. So, ask civilians in the country to reduce consumption of foods as their way of helping the war efforts. Okay? So, like I said, if you were living in the United States during this time, it was a great time to go on a diet, okay, in order to help us win the war. This is all about winning the war. Cut back on your food intake. support the soldiers. I mean, just do any and everything you can to help us win this war. Here's another department. We have Fuel Administration that's in charge of regulating coal and gasoline. Once again, these are items needed in order for us to win the war. Then you have the Emergency Ship Corporation that was in charge of building ships that was used to transport items, men, and anything else that the soldiers needed in order to win the war. So like I said, these departments were created to help us win the war. The Committee of Public Information was created to help win support for the war. The Selective Service Act was created to mobilize individuals to actually go out and fight in the war. Everything during this time in history was about the war. So here's the million-dollar question. How did we pay for the war? We paid for the war two ways. We did it the old-fashioned way, taxes. The taxes that come out of your paycheck, the taxes that you pay when you pay your property taxes every year. It's just simple. I don't know what else to tell you. Taxes. The problem with taxes during this time is that collecting taxes wasn't enough. In fact, it only covered about a third of the amount that we needed to engage in this war, be successful in this war, but most importantly, win the war. All right, so someone, don't know who it is, won't be on the test, thought of this idea called a bond. Let's issue bonds. Let's sell bonds. Now, in order for you to really understand this, you need to know what is a bond. A bond is basically a certificate. The government gives you this piece of paper and you give the government money. Yeah, it's not the other way around. I know it's tax season where the government's giving you money, but in this case, you're actually letting the government borrow money in exchange for this certificate. This certificate outlines the details of the loan that you provided the government with. If you read, the government borrows money from individuals, and the details of this bond is basically a promise to pay you back with interest. Okay? When that time is up, you go to the government, you hand them your certificate, and they give you back your money. That is how we pay for the war. Not only will we use this method to pay for this war, but we will also use this method to pay for World War II. In fact, today in 2020, the United States government still sells bonds. They still want to borrow money. Check it out. So, besides needing the money, besides needing to get people to support the war, understand that regardless of how many posters you post, how many propaganda articles you publish, people in this country will always figure out the shade or like some falsified information that's being given to us. So the government was very aware that we would have what we call dissenters, people that are going against whatever it is the government is promoting. And the government decided, hey, if we're going to win this war, we must limit free speech. Yes, free speech. They limited free speech by creating two laws that you guys will need to know for the test. One is called the Espionage Act. This allowed the government to monitor books, articles, things that came in the mail for you. And if they didn't like what was being published, if they didn't like the latest book by Stephen King, they had the authority to say, you know what? This can't be sold. This can't be in the library. This letter, this publication that's going out into the mail will no longer go out to the person that is supposed to receive it. That was the Espionage Act. And if And this law also prevented anyone from interfering in the draft. So if someone was trying to hide men that were supposed to report to the military due to their names getting pulled off of the draft list, they would be arrested. Okay, so the Espionage Act gave the government the authority to arrest anyone that interfered with the draft and to monitor materials that were printed that could possibly send the wrong message about the war. The second law that was created is called the Sedition Act of 1918. The Sedition Act of 1918 made it a crime for anyone to voice their opinion against the government. If you were basically talking shit about the government, you were arrested. If you spoke out against the government, if you didn't stand up for the pledge, okay, or the flag, you were arrested. If you just had any shady things to say about the government, you were arrested during this time, because in their eyes, you are now the enemy. Now, they were arresting thousands of people during the war. And one particular person that was arrested goes by the name of Charles Schneck. Okay? What was he arrested for? He was arrested for violating the Espionage Act. He was actually writing articles and encouraging men to resist the draft. And that's a big no-no, because we needed those men to go to Europe in order to win the war. So he was arrested, but he retaliated by filing a lawsuit against the government, claiming that they violated his free speech rights. But because the war was taking place during this time, the courts decided that, look, we're not violating your rights. Your rights don't matter right now. What matters right now is national security and us winning the war. So during wartime, your freedoms have to be limited in order to achieve a much bigger and more important cause. You need to know that. You need to know the outcome of this court case titled Schneck versus the United States. I think the bell's about to ring, so I may have to pause for a moment and continue this lecture in a few minutes. So I really want to finish this, and I'm going to make it really quick, no more than 5 minutes. It's really important to understand that despite the fact that the war took place in Europe, groups of individuals here in the United States were dramatically affected by World War I. So I just want to give you a quick rundown of those groups and how they were actually impacted by the war. Let's start off with women. Women supported the war wholeheartedly because they wanted something out of this war. What were women seeking? They were seeking the right to vote. And due to them showing their patriotism, they gained the right to vote in 1919. But in addition to gaining the right to vote, women were now working. And I'm not talking about working in the home. They were working outside of their homes, and they were focusing on working in factories and other places that were experiencing a labor shortage due to the fact that all the men were fighting in Europe. So this is when you start to see the working women. This is when you start to see women, wear the pants because the guys are gone. German Americans. This was not a good time for German Americans. In addition to all of the propaganda techniques depicting them as, the enemy, they were calling them bloodthirsty Huns. And in German, Huns is a really, really derogatory and offensive word to identify someone as. So we were really in the business of, making them look like the enemy in order to rally support for the war. Most of the rumors that were spread about them were untrue. German books and anything dealing with the German culture was disregarded and removed. There were thousands of German Americans accused of being spies and often put in jail. So yeah, this was not a good time for anyone that was German. In fact, hundreds, if not thousands of Germans changed their names and disassociated themselves with the German culture in order to remain safe here in the United States. American Indians and Hispanic Americans took advantage of this opportunity by enlisting in the war. Why were they enlisting in a war? For a country that has a history of being so disrespectful to them. If you read the PowerPoint, it goes on to tell you that they were doing this as an incentive for citizenship. Okay, for citizenship. And there are benefits when someone decides to volunteer and join the military. I mean, you are getting paid for this. Duh. Let's talk about African Americans now. There's a lot going on here with African Americans. They're still not getting fair treatment. There's constant discrimination. There's racial segregation in the form of Jim Crow laws. Yet thousands of African Americans volunteer to fight for the Americans. So you're probably wondering why? Why? Well, number one, it's a damn job, okay? And the truth is, you know, those opportunities were not available for African Americans. So enlisting in the Army is, you know, a sign of possible prosperity. Now, they're in Europe. They're stationed in separate units due to Jim Crow. But while living in countries in Europe, like, for example, France, they're undergoing an experience that doesn't involve so much racism. So thousands of African Americans return home after the war, and they're now encouraged. They're encouraged to fight for justice. They're encouraged to fight to eliminate Jim Crow laws because they have had a different experience. Now, let's talk about the African Americans that did not enlist in the Army. Those African Americans that stayed here in the United States during the war actually migrated, guys. They migrated to the North. And they migrated to the North for two reasons. Don't forget this. They migrated for economic opportunities because all the men were gone. And number two, they migrated to escape Jim Crow laws. They was like, forget that. I'm tired of living like I'm still a slave. Let's move. Let's move up north. Maybe things will get better. It didn't, but that's a whole nother story. And last but not least, I just want to mention some new things that were taking place as a result of the war. There's some technology going on. And that technology really helped in the war because prior to this, the Allies and the Central Powers were engaging in trench warfare. And if you did your homework, you should know that trench warfare was not helping both sides. In fact, it resulted in millions of soldiers on both sides dying of disease, dying of all sorts of stuff. It was just a hot, boiling mess. So the invention of these weapons during the war resulted in the war ending at a much quicker pace. Make sure you write down these new forms of weapons. During World War I, the machine guns, airships, poisonous gas, you see it, write it down. And what you're going to notice is that as we enter World War II, we continue to improve technology in warfare. And when you think about our military today, we're not even using tanks. We're using drones. I mean, we've become very sophisticated in how we engage in warfare, which could result in more lives dying and more soldiers off the field. So I'm going to wrap this up. I got a class waiting for me. I hope this was quick. I hope this was engaging. And I hope you actually watched it on your own. Have a great day. See you when I see you.